All right. It's so great to have you here, Bruce, to discuss reasonableness. For those who don't know Bruce, he is on the steering committee of the National Right to Housing Network. He's a well-known international human rights expert, and I think we're especially pleased to have him here today because I believe Bruce was involved in drafting some of the principles for reasonableness that we refer to in this training, and he even helped to argue the group boom case that we discussed. So, Bruce, I would love to pass it to you to hear from you about how you would define reasonableness. And could you give us a sense of who can use it and what it's for?
Well, thanks, Sahar. Really glad to be here. Actually, just a correction. I didn't help to argue Kudapun, but I argued with the people who were arguing with it. So arguing it, and yeah, it goes back a long way. But yeah, so I don't think I can really define reasonableness because it's actually more of a kind of overall conceptual framework and approach for assessing compliance with the right to housing and other social and economic rights, which, as you point out in the module, references back to the standards in Article 2 of the Covenant that it has to use all appropriate means and apply the maximum of available resources, and include, reasonable steps and so on to be progressively realizing the right to housing. And actually, and so those are the kind of key standards in the covenant. The covenant itself doesn't reference reasonableness, but it did get referenced very early on. And you can imagine how, if you're the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights trying to figure out what the right to housing means, you're immediately confronted with situations where it kind of depends on the circumstances to decide what complies with the right to housing and what doesn't. So in general comment 4, they already talk about, how the rent has to be affordable, which means that it has to be kind of a reasonable cost, and any rent increase, they can't say it shouldn't be more than $25. They can't be precise, but they have to develop an idea that you can assess compliance in a way that is adjusted to particular circumstances. And that's really the core of what reasonableness means. And so it references some of the key elements of human rights obligations and guarantees, right? So the fundamental element is that it has to be consistent with the dignity of rights holders. And the second really key element is that it has to be capable of realizing the right. In other words, reasonableness isn't an excuse that says, well, homelessness in Canada is reasonable because what the hell, it would cost too much to house people. That's not what reasonableness means at all. Maybe what governments try to tell us is reasonable, but that's not what reasonableness means. It means that you have to have a plan in place to realize the right. But reasonableness also recognizes that something may take some time. It may require allocation of resources, which may have some limitations. And it may involve decision-making where you're considering other people's rights. So, for example, is an eviction reasonable? Generally, you have to assume that it's a violation of the right to housing. But there are circumstances where it may be reasonable because somebody is completely infringing someone else's right to adequate housing through sexual harassment or something. And so those kinds of balancing considerations are what reasonableness ends up entailing. And it generally it moves us away from the idea that you can define the right to housing as if it means the same thing everywhere for everyone, and realize that it's actually a way of thinking about what is required, which recognizes these issues that are more value oriented and contingent on what the circumstances are. But I would really emphasize that it's a rigorous standard. It's one that says this is very, very serious, and it's not easy to justify any kind of infringement of the right to housing as being reasonable. It has to comply with the right to housing and be limited in some fashion which is consistent with the recognition of housing as a fundamental human right.
Okay, I'm glad you raised that last piece, and I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit on, I guess when I hear this, my concern is, could the federal government or any level of government use this standard to justify their existing policies and programs as reasonable in progressively realizing the right to housing? How would you speak to that?
Absolutely, that's a critical issue, and it is going to be a problem because a lot of the lawyers for the Department of Justice will have been trained in a notion of reasonableness as something that offers the government a defense. But we have to rethink reasonableness. It's not just a defense for governments, it's actually the substance of the right. And the understanding of reasonableness under international law as it's affirmed in the NHSA has to start from the perspective of the rights claimant. So it doesn't start with the government saying, well, you know, we looked at all these different things and we figure we did what we thought was reasonable. Even under the Charter of Rights, that hasn't been accepted. You know, the point is that governments may very well have done what they thought was reasonable, but the reason that we have a human rights system and a guaranteed human right is you offer the chance for the government's policies and decisions to be considered whether they are reasonable from the standpoint of the human right. And that starts with the dignity issues and the standpoint of the claimants. And then the question is, when you balance the different things, the rights of the claimants with whatever limitations or contextual factors may be, to some extent limiting the government's ability to respond, then you know, you recognize that this isn't something absolute. Everyone isn't going to be able to have a right to housing realized immediately. And everyone's right to housing is going to mean something a bit different. And it's that dialogue between the claimant's dignity issues and the government's ability to realize the right that is the process that we institute through the NHSA. But it has to start from the opposite side of the government saying, here's our policies, we think they're reasonable, to the claimant saying, here's how these policies are affecting me, and here's what the right to housing should mean to me, and then assessing whether the government's policies are responsive to those circumstances. That's a very different understanding of reasonableness than some of the government lawyers may have been trained in.
That's a really important reframing. I think it aligns with our module later on meaningful engagement as well, and always putting the rights holder at the center.
Absolutely, yeah.